All right, welcome to BarleyBin Live. My name is Mitchell Japp. I'm the Research and Extension Manager with SAS Barley, and pleased to welcome you here tonight to Back 40 Brewery in Yorkton. We've got Twitter live stream going at the same time as an in-person event, so great to see all of you here in person. It's nice to be back in-person events, and wanted to really welcome you here and appreciate the welcome we've got as SAS Barley from Back 40 Brewery. Tammy and Trevor and Catherine have been great to work with to get this event organized, so thanks to them. For those of you in the room, if you have a chance to put your cell phones on silent, appreciate that. Everybody's got drinks. We've got food planned here for a little bit later. What we're going to do is we're going to go through a couple of speakers, and then we'll take a break. Our live stream will actually end at that point, and we'll come back with one more speaker. One of our speakers, unfortunately, wasn't able to make it today, and so we had a pinch hit from Lauren Wensley at CCAN. So really appreciate that, Lauren. But she had done a presentation in the Saskatoon event that we did a couple weeks ago. So just to give you a little bit of a background on what BarleyBin Live is, the idea behind it was, just imagine you're in a bar or a coffee shop and you run into your favorite barley researcher or extension specialist, and you strike up a conversation because you've got a bit of time, they've got a bit of time, and you realize you've got a burning question that person is the exact right person to have answered. And so you ask your question, you pitch it to them, and it just so happens that they've got all the details that they need right then and there to give you that thorough, complete answer to your question. And so we posed some questions to our speakers tonight, and we'll hear their responses as we go through the evening. But before we get started with the speakers, I just want to give you a little bit of background from SAS Barley's side. We've got a number of different communication mediums going, and are really looking forward to our spring magazine coming out very shortly. That's going to be launched to the website, and it's gone to the printer press, and will be heading to producers' mailboxes here very shortly. The image on the left of the screen, that's from our fall magazine that we kickstarted there. That's a transition from a newsletter we used to put out twice a year, and we're going with twice a year for a fuller magazine. Get lots of content from SAS Barley on Twitter. It's not on here, but we do have a YouTube channel as well, which the videos from our live stream tonight and the one in Saskatoon will eventually migrate to that platform. We've got a podcast, which we started about a year ago. Season 3 should be heading out to whatever you get your podcasts in the next few weeks. And our e-newsletter comes out monthly, which includes a market report. We're a pretty lean organization, so we run with a small handful of staff. There's myself, our executive director, Jill McDonald, and our communications services are delivered by Coles Ag. So they do all the communications for SAS Barley. And because we run a fairly lean ship, we're able to put a lot of our investment into research, which is producers' dollars are returning investment for them. So quite a number of projects on the go, and actually ran a project last year to look at the rate of return to producers. And this is just for variety development. For every dollar invested from the barley checkoff, return of $26 back to producers. So pretty good investment there. There's also lots of other projects on the feed side, agronomy, that SAS Barley funds as well. And pretty good milestone last year with 77% of expenses for SAS Barley were invested and directed towards research. So SAS Barley, as I mentioned, lean organization. We have 6 directors. We have 1 in attendance tonight. So Morris Berry's standing here at the back. So welcome, Morris. He's a new director to SAS Barley as of January, and 5 other directors with varying degrees of experience. Zenith Fay is close here at Foam Lake, but had another commitment tonight. Cody Glenn, way down in the southwest, is a new director this year as well. And then our chair is Keith Rive. He's a longtime director on Sask Barley, Matt Enns, and Glenn Logan. So our goal is to direct those farmer dollars towards research, because that's where we feel the best return is. And so certainly like to hear from producers and on what their challenges are and what they're seeing on the farm. But also we're here to communicate some of the results of the research that gets invested in back to you, so you can incorporate it in on your farm. And I just want to make a special acknowledgement. I mentioned Back 40 Brewery here earlier. Our speakers tonight, Dr. Aaron Beattie, Dr. Greg Penner, Lauren Wensley, and Lyle Cowell. Lyle with Nutrien up in Tisdale. They had some pretty wicked snow here the last few days, and the roads are horrendous, so he wasn't able to make it today. But our plan with Lyle is that he had the presentation all built already, so we'll connect with him in a virtual format here in the next couple of weeks and make that available to you to listen. He was here going to talk about fertility, so we'll certainly do that, and certainly appreciate all the speakers and the time they put into their presentations and coming here tonight. From the Sask Barley and Coles Ag team, there's a few individuals that really stand out as to helping to make this happen. If it wasn't for them, this would just be an idea on a piece of paper or in a meeting. So good big shout out to Kristen, Delaney, Jeff, and Finn. And certainly Jill was very supportive from the concept as well. So our first presenter tonight is Dr. Aaron Beattie. Aaron's a barley breeder at the Crop Development Center at the University of Saskatchewan. He's also an associate professor there. His breeding program is focused primarily on two-row malting varieties, but also has a focus on feed, food, and forage barley varieties. And the Crop Development Center has released 7 barley varieties over the last 10 years. Some of those include CDC Fraser, CDC Churchill, CDC Copper, and CDC Renegade. Aaron is also involved in the Prairie Grain Development Committee, which is the committee that supports and evaluates new lines to become varieties. And he's the coordinator for the barley tables in the Saskatchewan Seed Guide. We posed a few questions to Aaron. First was, why did barley suffer so much last year in the drought? It seemed to suffer a little bit more than some of the other crops. And so we're wondering if there's anything from a genetics perspective or a variety perspective that if there was any details there and as to why barley suffered. And one of the questions we had coming into Sask Barley last year was about what happens when barley heads get stuck in the boot. Is the yield potential still there? Is it right off at that point? And then more from the quality side, what differences are there amongst varieties from a malt quality perspective, and what end users prefer, which quality aspects, and what new quality traits are being looked at? So with that, Aaron, you're up. Just a few questions for you.
Excellent. Well, it's good to see everyone live here. As Mitchell said, it's good to see people face to face. And like I say to my class, just interrupt me anytime if there's something that catches your interest that I'm saying. Interrupt me. My kids do it all the time, so I'm pretty used to it. So some of those questions that I prepared a bit more on the quality side of things, but the question pertaining to heads in the boot, perhaps you did notice that a bit this year. If you've been using plant growth regulators in the past, maybe that's something you've noticed as well in the field, that maybe they're stuck in the boot a little bit longer. Even sometimes the variety you're using that may be something that's a little bit more of a tendency. So we've typically, in our program, we've seen that sort of phenotype in certain types of barley, irregardless of the growing conditions. So if you're growing barley that has a European background, so Secan, some of the other companies are starting to introduce some of these European varieties. That's a bit more of a tendency in those varieties. They tend to be semi-dwarf varieties, which is sort of akin to if you are using a PGR, and that's a phenotype that you'll tend to see. So it may not be necessarily due to the environment, it actually may be the variety. And from what I've seen, based on sort of normal growing years where I'm observing that, there really isn't a yield penalty associated with that kind of situation. Barley starts to flower while it's still in the boot anyway, so it's already fertilizing itself, and those seeds are starting to develop even before the head gets out of the boot. So maybe the biggest impact that you might see is an impact on disease. If it is a sort of a normal wetter year, those kernels that are still kind of wrapped up a little bit in the boot may get a little bit more moist. You may see some more staining with them. Perhaps fusarium might develop a little bit more. So as far as I know, there's not a real yield penalty associated with that. And then the other question there pertaining to barley suffering last year, I'm probably not in the best position to kind of say how barley did relative to other crops, because I'm mostly focusing on barley. I think growers would probably have a better sense of that. The one piece of information I can maybe say is, at least within varieties and germplasm that we saw growing last year, we were probably quite surprised to see how badly some varieties did and how well other ones did, relatively speaking. So at those sites that were really stressed out, so we're talking, if you're in the Saskatoon area, you might have seen yields that were maybe 50% of normal, which was pretty much in line with the amount of rainfall we got compared to normal. So we saw that under those conditions, there were some varieties that still managed to, relatively speaking, do pretty well. So they were actually out yielding some other varieties by as much as 20%. So this is a big reduction overall, because we're still talking about a 50% reduction in yield, but there was a big difference in terms of how they dealt with that stress. And that was a surprise, because if we had gone back to 2020, we would have had two varieties that performed essentially the same from a yield point of view, but then you bring in this heat stress, drought stress tolerance last year, and suddenly one of them is doing a lot better. So for us, it's a bit of an unknown. I think one potential reason that you see differential performance like that, probably, at least in some aspect, has to do with the root system, how far it's able to go and find water. We know there are differences that exist between crop types, but also within crop types. And that would be sort of my best guess is why we're seeing differences, at least within barley variety performance. And so we're kind of taking last year as an opportunity to, now that we understand varieties that do perform better, we can use those as parents moving forward, so that that next generation of feed or malt varieties that come through hopefully will incorporate some of that stress tolerance that we saw last year. So it was a real pain to go through last year, and we're sort of still feeling that pain, because our seed supplies are really low this year. We're having trouble getting enough to do our normal amount of work that we would do this summer, but at the same time, you kind of have to take the good with the bad on that one there. So I probably can't tell you much more than that, but there's an educated guess for you on what was going on, at least with barley. So. But moving on to maybe some things I do know a little bit about, which is quality. So we had some questions related to quality, and so that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today. Like I said, just interrupt me if there's something that strikes your interest. So in barley, especially, I'm focusing here obviously on malt quality. That's a big topic. About 50% of the acres that we see out there every year are seeded to malt varieties. They're not always intended to be targeting for malt selection, but that's always the hope. But when we think about quality, we've got some different ways that we actually characterize what quality is. And in Canada, we kind of break quality down into two big categories that I've kind of highlighted here on this table. So on the left, we're talking, or sorry, across the top of the table there, those are just kind of the different end users that might use malt barley. So we've got sort of adjunct brewers. So those would be the big multinationals like Coors, Anheuser-Busch. So they tend to buy a very small amount of malt, relatively speaking to how much beer they make. They will then add in some other source of starch like corn grits or rice. And so what those users are trying to look for in their malt is that malt has to have a lot of what we call enzymatic power, or basically starch degrading power. So starch is that form of sugar that the seed uses as a storage component. But the yeast that is used in brewing to make alcohol, they can't actually use starch. They have to use simple sugars like glucose. And so it's the enzymes there that's highlighted as alpha amylase and diastatic power. Those two things are measurements of that starch degrading power. So how much starch they can convert to simple sugars. So if you're an adjunct brewer, those barley enzymes have to not only break down the starch in the barley grain, has to break down the starch in the adjunct, that corn or rice. And so that's why they need a lot of enzymes. And so their goal is to produce a lot of alcohol with as little malt as possible. So that's why you tend to get these lighter beers that are being produced. If you drink Coors, if you drink Bud Light, that's the kind of beer that uses that kind of malt. So that malt is defined by high protein, relatively speaking, so kind of 11.5 to 13% is a range. Those high enzyme levels there, so we measure them in alpha amylase, it's called dextrinizing units. So over 60, and then over 140 if we're talking about the diastatic power. The other aspect of this is beta-glucan. So beta-glucan is a cell wall polysaccharide. It's important because when you're going through that brewing process, specifically the lautering process, beta-glucan is a viscous substance, so it's going to slow down that lautering process. So if you're trying to produce, which is typically the case, let's say Anheuser-Busch, they're trying to get that beer made as quickly as possible and turn over as many batches as they can in a month. So if you're slowing down the lautering process, even by a couple of hours, that's a big deal to them. So having really low levels of beta-glucan is a really important characteristic for them. So that's kind of one group of malt quality. So historically, we'd think of something like Metcalfe fitting that profile. The one in the middle there, the all malt brewing and distilling. So that's sort of what these folks here would be doing. So when they make their beer, they're not using adjuncts. It's an entire 100% malt. So essentially what we're saying there is the enzymes in that barley grain, it only needs to break down the starch in the barley grain. It doesn't have to worry about an adjunct. So we don't need as many enzymes in that case. So you can see then that the protein's lower, the alpha amylase and diastatic power are all a bit lower. You can be a little bit more flexible on the beta-glucan because really processing time is important, but maybe it's not quite as important as an industrial scale brewer. So again, if you're thinking about varieties, you're going to think about something like Copeland coming along as being sort of our classic one that would fit that profile. Grain distilling over there on the right, I'm actually a little bit more ignorant of that area because we don't hear as much about it. We know that the maltsters in Canada make malt for grain distilling, but we're not really clear in terms of. It's not like they're using different varieties. They're probably using Metcalfe. They're just malting it probably longer to really develop those enzymes. But the two things at the bottom there that are worth noting, there's this one compound called glycosidic nitrile, which I'll talk about. And that's a compound that's really only relevant when you get into distilling. And I'll talk to you about some new work going on that's trying to deal with that particular characteristic there. So what you can see is that they're really aiming for really low levels of glycosidic nitrile. And I'll explain that in a moment there. But you've heard a lot probably about craft brewing, and in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a real increase in it across North America in terms of the number of breweries that would kind of fit this definition of craft brewers. And the way they define craft brewing in the US is it's any brewery that's making less than 6 million barrels of beer in a year. It also has to have less than 25% ownership by a larger brewer that is not a craft brewer, because what they were finding is that those big companies like Anheuser-Busch was buying up all these small craft brewers, and they were trying to slide into this definition, so they've actually altered their definition in recent years. But what this chart is just trying to show you is how much malt is being bought by sort of that craft brewing segment versus the non-craft segment. So you can see that over time, it's kind of reached this level where it's nearly a 50-50 usage rate, which is quite amazing, because the craft brewers by beer, by volume, only represent about 10% of the market. So 10% of the beer is using 50% of the malt that's used. So that's why if you're a barley producer, if you're a maltster, you love the craft brewing industry, because they make these all malt beers. So they use a disproportionately large amount of malt for the amount of beer that they actually make. So a group like this, the more of these kinds of companies that pop up, it's great news for the barley industry as a whole there. So I always find that graph kind of quite interesting. So just in terms of maybe new things going on, new traits that we're trying to incorporate into some of these new varieties coming along. This is one that is a little bit niche because of it fits just this distilling industry, but it's a compound which we just for simplicity call it the GN, or the low GN trait. So GN stands for a compound called glycosidic nitrile, and within barley there is one particular compound which we call EPH, or epiheterodendron, which is one type of glycosidic nitrile. And so that little chart there at the bottom is just basically showing you how this compound is, where it fits into the process. So in the barley grain, you have amino acids. One of them is leucine. And during that malting process, that leucine is converted to EPH. And then during the, if that barley malt gets used in distilling, during that fermentation phase, there's a compound or an enzyme called beta-glucosidase, which is produced by the yeast used in fermentation, that converts it into that very long compound there. And then during that distillation process, so once you add heat to it, it's converted to hydrogen cyanide, and then in the presence of ethanol, which is obviously being made in the distilling process, and the copper that's used in some of the vessels, you get this compound called ethyl carbamate. And so ethyl carbamate is a carcinogen. And so if you can knock out that pathway by essentially not having any EPH being made, you lower the presence of glycosidic nitrile, which removes that potential toxin or carcinogen that's being made during the distilling process. So when distillers are looking for malt, they're looking for low GN malt to use. And one recent work that's been going on in Canada is that we've identified through some germplasm that we've brought in from Europe, lines that actually have a mutation in those enzymes that make the EPH. So those enzymes not being present means no EPH is made, which means there's no carcinogen being made. And so a few programs in Canada right now, there have been a couple of newer lines that have been supported for registration. They haven't been commercialized yet, but they're in the process. The two numbers there, 14617, that's a variety that came out of the program at the Field Crop Development Center in Lacombe. And the other line there came from the Ag Canada program in Brandon. So you may see coming in the next few years, these two lines, which will have names attached to them, that will fit and may be in demand within that distilling market within Canada. So something to look out for there. This little figure just on the bottom there, this is just showing you how we actually select for this trait. So we've actually know where the mutation is in the genome. You can actually use molecular markers, which just basically identify that mutation. So I don't actually have to measure ethyl carbamate. All I have to do is find this location in the genome. It'll tell me if that line has the mutation or not. I pick the ones that have the mutation. It's as simple as that. So it's kind of a nice, simple tool to select for what otherwise is kind of a complex trait to measure there. So that's one thing that you may hear about if you're talking to maltsters down probably in about 3 or 4 years, you end up hearing a little bit more about this. The other one, another trait I just thought I'd mention is this so-called loxless trait. So if any of you have grown varieties like Polar Star or Platinum Star or maybe Gold Star. So these are offered, they were traditionally offered through Cargill, which is now Boort Malt. The malt plant in Bigger there, so also known as Prairie Malt. They were offering a certain number of varieties that they would purchase and were only being malted at that plant. And the reason for that is they had certain varieties had this characteristic which we call the loxless trait. And so the way this one works, again, it's an enzyme that converts some compounds into other ones that are undesirable. So in this case, what I'm showing at the top there is just a simple fatty acid, which is converted through an enzyme called lipase, which breaks off those fatty acid chains. And what I'm showing there is one fatty acid called linoleic acid. So again, this is happening during the malting process. So this LOX enzyme, it basically converts this linoleic acid into that H pod, that 9H pod. And so that compound actually makes its way through the malting process and it sits in the beer. It doesn't have any negative attributes in and of itself. But if that beer sits on the shelf for a long time, it'll naturally break down into those two compounds on the bottom there, one called thode and one called trans-2-nonenal. And those two compounds actually have some impacts when you drink the beer. So on the one called thode actually impacts something that they call foam stability. So depending on what country you're in, Japan for one, they actually like to know that when they pour a beer into a glass that it's going to have a big head and that head is going to stay there for a while. That's considered a positive attribute in their beer. So if you have too much thode building up in your beer, that head retention basically never happens. It just disappears as soon as you pour that beer. The other compound there called trans-2-nonenal basically imparts sort of a cardboardy flavor to the beer. So if you've had a beer that's been sitting in your fridge for 6 or 8 months and you pull it out, it may not quite taste as fresh. If it has a bit of a stale taste to it, it's probably due to this trans-2-nonenal. So through some work that was done with Sapporo breweries, they had again identified some barley germplasm that did not have this LOX activity. So if you don't have the LOX activity, you never get the breakdown products down there in the bottom. And so they did some work to incorporate that into some Canadian germplasm. Some of you may remember a variety called CDC Kendall. It was maybe popular about 10 years ago. It was one that Sapporo was using quite regularly. So they back-crossed in this loxless trait, and that was what Polar Star was. So Polar Star is essentially Kendall, except it's got this loxless mutation in it. So that chart on the on the left there is showing the amount of this trans-2-nonenal, this thode compound in beer that's been made from Kendall versus Polar Star. So you've got 3 different bars there. The blue one is fresh beer, and then the other 2 are sort of artificially aged beer. So they'll let the beer sit at 37 degrees for a week or 30 degrees for a week. So they're trying to simulate it sitting on the shelf for a long time. So what you're really seeing there is that there's less of that trans-2-nonenal in that Polar Star. And then the other chart there is showing you this, it's basically a measurement of foam stability. So this NIBIN test is simply a very simple test. You pour a beer into a glass and you watch how long it takes for that head to disappear. So what you can see there is in the Polar Star that it's taking longer for that head to disappear. And when they do taste tests with panels, they can see they actually get differences in the ratings of this beer that's been produced with or without this loxless trait. So again, there's a number of varieties that we've produced through our program that carry this loxless mutation. So that's something else that kind of makes Canadian malt barley unique, at least within the North American perspective. You don't have these varieties being produced in the US, so it's a little bit of an advantage if you're a Canadian grower there. And then this kind of ties into the flavor idea. So if in the craft world, flavor is a big topic of discussion, and whether it's coming from the yeast or whether it's coming from the hops, there's a lot of interest in knowing if there's differences in malt flavor due to the varieties that you're making the malt from. And so a couple of years ago, we grew a number of different, fairly common and some newer varieties. It's a little bit hard to see there, but we've got Bow, Connect, Copeland, and Harrington that we're growing. And we grew them at 3 different locations across Canada, or Western Canada, so Brandon, Saskatoon, and Lacombe. And then we looked at, could you tell any differences if you malted them all the same, and then you brewed them all exactly the same, gave them to a panel, can you tell any differences based on variety? Can you tell any differences in flavor based on location that they were grown in? So this little spider chart here is just basically looking at different compounds or flavors. So dimethyl sulfide is kind of, maybe you'd think of it as sort of a sweet corn taste. Ethyl acetate would be sort of like a nail polish, if you thought of that kind of flavor or smell more accurately. Acetaldehyde is sort of associated with sort of green apples, grainy, malty, sweet, bitter, and then astringent, sort of how dry the beer tastes. The kind of take-home message here is that really there was not really any differences in flavor profile based on the variety used or the location grown. So at least within the Canadian perspective of malting varieties, there's not a lot of difference in flavor. There may be, if you start looking a little bit wider, maybe European or Australian germplasm, there might be differences there, and that's kind of the next phase of the project, is kind of to evaluate that, because there is still a lot of feeling out there, especially with some older varieties that, maybe had been grown 40, 50 years ago, that they may impart some different flavors that can be picked up in the beer. So that's a topic, if you get around enough craft brewers, that they'll end up getting onto flavor pretty quickly there. So that was kind of a fun project. I don't know if Lauren, are you going to talk about varieties now that you're here? Yeah. So I might skip this one then if Lauren's going to cover out. This was just going to kind of show you some of the newer varieties in terms of how they hit some of those different sort of Metcalf replacement or Copeland replacement. But maybe what I will show you is this instead. So as you likely know, all the varieties of malt barley that are being used right now, they're all hulled varieties. That's sort of normal. That hull has a purpose within the lautering process. But over the last decade or so, probably longer than that, we've also been working on developing hulless barley that have malt characteristics. And so that's what this chart is showing you here. So it's got a lot of data on it, but really the most relevant one to pay attention to here is the one called F extract or fine extract. So that basically is saying how much alcohol can be produced per unit of malt. And so at the top there, you've got Synergy, which is sort of a newer up and coming hulled malt variety. So you can see its extract value is around 80, which is pretty typical for the hulled varieties. The big difference with the hullless ones is how much bigger that extract value is. So you're getting anywhere from 5 to 7% increase in extract. So that's a real, especially to a brewer like an adjunct brewer, that could potentially represent a lot of revenue over the course of a year, because you're really producing a lot more alcohol per unit of barley. So if you've ever grown hullless barley, you know that there is a yield penalty associated with them, because that hull is not being collected as part of what you're selling to the end user. So these varieties, they kind of wane in terms of how much interest there is in them. But right now there is a project going on with GW Breweries in Saskatoon where they are actually starting to use some of these hullless varieties, the one called CDC Clear there, which is a hullless variety, in their beers. So they're trying to make a case that not only is there an extract benefit, but there may be a flavor benefit as well, because you haven't got those hulls being part of the process. You remove the hulls, that changes the flavor profile. So there may be some attraction there to other brewers to maybe start thinking about using this malt. So it may be something that you see down the road there. So that's my quick and dirty view on quality there. That's a lot in 10 minutes, but if you've got a question now or later, I'm not sure how you want to do it.
So one of the other quality traits that was affected in 2021 was protein.
Right.
You know, CMPTC's got a chart. They show the average protein over the last 10 years. And, you know, that hovers kind of around that 12% every year, except this year is about 14. And so that's outside of the range you showed in your chart.
Yeah.
What's the impact on the maltsters and the brewers?
Yeah, well, they end up buying what they can. So the question there is, so with the high proteins that we're seeing in 2021, what's that going to do in terms of the maltsters and brewers' ability to do what they normally do? And so yeah, the short answer is they take what they can get. They selected as much malt or barley as they could that sort of was in that normal range, but then obviously they've gone higher. From a maltster's point of view, that's going to change how well they can modify that barley into hit those specs. And so usually where you're going to see things suffering is that extract values. So extract is pretty highly related to starch content. So when you've got that much protein, you've got less starch in there, your extract values are going to drop. So that means the brewer is going to be not quite as happy as they normally would. It's probably going to take more fiddling in the malt house for them to figure out how to malt it to get somewhere close to their normal specs. It may actually require longer in the malt house, which again is costing them money. So the more energy, the more time it's in the malt house, they're losing money on that. So it's not great, but I'm sure they have their orders, so they would have had to meet them somehow. Yeah. So yeah, a future.
Yeah, the future, I guess, or any developments.
Okay, so yeah, the question was, is there much? What's going to happen with 6-row barley down the road? As far as I know, there is really no more activity in 6-row breeding in Canada. Some of the programs that we're doing it are sort of phasing it out and just sort of running through the material that they have left. I think the strong signal, especially from the brewing and malting industry, was that they weren't interested in those types anymore. So there's no purchasing essentially. There's probably limited amounts of it, but really even companies, the last company that was really the big holdout on using 6-row varieties was Anheuser-Busch, but 10, 15 years ago, they made the switch to say that we're just going to focus on 2-row. So I think we're seeing, although I think, I've heard from some growers that they find 6 rows will work well under certain conditions. I mean, I think the 2 rows are quite competitive, and certainly from the grain quality point of view, they're fairly superior. And especially when you get into diseases like Fusarium head blight, again, the 2 rows are head and shoulders above the 6 rows. So I think that's those combinations of traits are kind of, we're seeing the end of them, I would say.
So like this used to be the heartland of 6-row country.
Yeah.
And it just seems like a lot of the 2 rows don't seem to have performed. I mean, you're talking about areas of 6-row are better, this is one.
Yeah.
So I mean, is there any thought to breeding specifically 2-row barley's trying to get into the 6-row niche that was out there?
Yeah, and I think this is just in terms of how well they perform in an area. Yeah, so the comment was that certain areas, the 6 rows did outperform the 2 rows, and wondering if there's specific breeding to kind of replace that. I mean, I guess when we do our upfront breeding work, we are really trying to assess how well they do in different geographies. And I was saying to another individual here earlier that this area actually is a bit of a, from our barley point of view, a bit of a dead zone when it comes to testing barley varieties out before they're ever released. And it is a bit of a failing, I think, of our testing system that we don't have better coverage in this area. But when I look at it, I guess it depends if you're talking malt or feed, but I think there are some feed varieties coming along in the 2 row that I would bet would be a pretty suitable replacement for those 6 rows. They're probably little bit shorter in stature, they're standing up better, and they seem to have that really high, consistent yield to them. I'm thinking mostly feeds in this case, but yeah, I mean, there is awareness that you do want to kind of hit all the geographies with performance.
Just back on the 6-year-old question, is there any difference between 2 and 6-year-old salinity bonus?
There's, from what I've seen, no. I at least in the groups that I've seen most of the salinity work done, which is in Australia, again, they've sort of sampled a wide set of germplasm, and the ones that seem to rise to the top are always the 2 rows in that case. So it may be that there's a disproportionate amount of 2 row that they're sampling from, but that seems to be the case.
We have a question online as well. Why is higher protein barley more acceptable for China malt in their beer marketplace?
So the question is, why is higher protein malt acceptable in the Chinese marketplace? They tend to. The one thing we do hear a lot about from the Chinese market is they're always talking about protein, and I don't know if it's still a carryover from looking at the older varieties versus the newer ones. So typically, high enzymes and high protein went hand in hand, and so high enzymes is something that the Chinese market really values a lot. The newer varieties are lower protein, but they still have those high enzymes. So I think it's a bit of they're buying the high protein, expecting to get higher enzymes, and they seem a little bit more flexible in general than probably the North American market. When they buy barley, they are always willing to take new varieties sooner than the domestic market. They're not as fussy about that kind of thing. So I think they just seem to, their standard for what's good is maybe a little bit lower. I'm not saying that what we're sending them is poor, but they seem to have a wider range of what they're willing to accept. Right on. That was easy.
Thanks, Eric.
Right on.
Appreciate it. Next up is Dr. Greg Penner. He's a professor in the Department of Animal and Poultry Science at the University of Saskatchewan and holds the Centennial Enhancement Chair in Nutritional Physiology. He has more than 140 papers published in peer-reviewed journals. That's a lot. And he is quite active in teaching both graduate and undergraduate students. So we asked Dr. Penner what producers need to know about feeding in situations like 2021 and 2022, when test weight is light, quality may be questionable, and costs are very high. Greg, you're up.
Thanks, Mitch. Thanks, everyone, for coming. It's certainly been a fun year feeding cattle within our university systems with the barley that we're seeing this year. I'm fortunate enough to be able to do work both on the dairy side, but also on the feedlot side. I work on the cow-calf side, and so we have a pretty broad experience in terms of the cattle we're feeding. I thought I'd put the context, and I think Aaron did it already, and Mitch already highlighted some of the changes we're seeing. The barley we saw this year was really high crude protein. A lot of our protein that we were getting in our samples was in the 16, 17%. So quite a bit higher than the 14% that Mitch mentioned. We're seeing lower starches, and so from a cattle perspective, that means lower energy. We probably not all that different from the maltsters, where we're really looking at that barley from an energy standpoint, and we probably don't value the protein as much as we should, but certainly we had excess protein this year, and in some cases that might actually be a little bit of a problem for us. And then the other aspect has been higher fiber, and of course with these lighter test weight barleys came smaller kernel size. And that really challenges, I guess, how we process barley and what we do. And I don't think the processing is different, but we need to pay a little more attention to how we process that barley and how we assess the severity of that barley processing to make sure we get what we're paying for from a barley resource. So one of the questions Mitch asked was, how do we process that lightweight barley? And my simple answer is the exact same way as we process heavyweight barley, except we're probably, if we're using a roller mill, we're going to have to tighten those rollers quite a bit, make that gap width a lot smaller to make sure we actually damage each kernel. And so there's some opportunities that come with it. I think probably what we saw was a greater challenge maybe is some more barley being blended. So some adequate weight barley being blended with some lightweight barley. And I think the 2-row barleys probably are reducing kernel size variation. But from a feeding perspective, recognize we're bringing in loads of barley from all over the place. And so whether it's producers blending or our bins blending, the barley is being blended, and thick kernels and thin kernels create a problem for us when we're processing, because we end up over processing those thick kernels, and if we don't adjust the rollers, we end up under processing those thin kernels. So one of the things we've been doing a lot of at the U of S, and I don't think we're different than what's happening in the livestock sector, and of course they put me right after food, but we're taking a lot of fecal samples from our cattle. And from the feces, we're measuring the starch concentrations. And this is actually data that came out of 10 feedlots in Alberta. Former student of mine went following these feedlots over a year time frame. They were good feedlots, so these are not poor feedlots. And my student was collecting fecal samples from these pens, looking at the closeout responses, and coming back using near-infrared spectroscopy, so NIR, we have very good calibrations for fecal starch, and we were measuring that fecal starch concentration, and so you can see the range is huge, right? These are feedlots that were very well established. They know how to process barley, and I would say many of our feeders probably err on the side of being a little bit conservative. And so they under-process the barley because of risk of digestive disorders for cattle. And this is really the outcome. So you see our average is about 6% fecal starch, or at least the median would be about 6% fecal starch. And so that's a lot of starch that those cattle are consuming, and a lot of starch that is not being converted to energy. And you can see on the high end, we actually had one in that 26% starch. So when you ask me, how do I process starch, or how do I process barley, whether it's lightweight or heavyweight, the first thing I want to see is every kernel processed. And there's a number of tools or tricks that we can use to help make sure that all of those kernels are processed. So we worked with these large feedlots, and we went out there and we said, we're seeing a lot of fecal starch. Yep. These samples come from large pens. So these pens typically would have 200 head, and we would be sampling about 10% of the population in each pen to make sure that we were representing the pen, not an animal. And we only collected fresh fecal pats. So that way we could eliminate one animal representing multiple samples. We do this regularly in all our studies now, and really we're targeting under 4% starch. That's our goal. Okay. So we worked with these feedlot operators, looked at their closeout data, and looked at their feed conversion rate. So the gain to feed, we want to see high gains per unit of feed. And we related that back to fecal starch. In this case, you can see we're dealing with 6 feedlots. And the relationship is going the way we thought it would, right? If we have more starch coming out in feces, we had lower efficiency for those cattle to convert that barley into tissue growth. Okay, so pretty good, I think, justification to make sure we're doing an adequate job processing our barley. Doesn't matter the cost, right? Right now, it's probably a bigger issue from a feeding sector. And I would argue the same issue is there, whether we're dealing with cow-calf or we're dealing with the dairy industry. And in fact, we're measuring fecal starch in our dairy cattle on a regular basis. And And until we switched to corn, we were typically under 3% fecal starch. We've shifted into corn because of price, unfortunately, and now we're hitting 12% fecal starch in our dairy cattle because we don't have a flaking capability. So we would go into these feedlots, and one of the challenges, from an experimental standpoint, you go in, you see processing adequacy maybe wasn't sufficient, and we could mention that, but we don't want them to go in and really change their processing, because then all of a sudden we changed our experiment, and it might become difficult to find the outcome. But what you can clearly see, and yeah, there's not very many dots along that line, but the fit is pretty strong. And what you can see is that the lower they process that grain, so the processing index, the more fecal starch. And I already showed you more fecal starch meant less efficient feed conversion. So does anyone know what processing index is, how we assess the adequacy of cereal grain processing? You know how to measure bushel weight, right? So you can measure bushel weight of barley. It's a volume weight measurement. The processing index really is the same measurement, we just do it twice. Okay, so we do it once before processing, we do it once again after processing, and we take the after processing volume weight divided by the before processing volume weight. So when we process barley, we get smaller pieces. It takes more volume for the same amount of weight, right? So we get a lower weight density, and so we get a smaller number. So you can see the processing index values of 65 there resulted in much lower fecal starch, gave us greater feed conversions, and represent a more severely processed grain. Okay. Before getting into the next question, I wanted to highlight some of the economic values, and I wish from a feeding perspective we were much closer to that $150, $200 a metric ton barley grain. Last price I saw, we were in the 440. What are we at now? 380? I think it's softened a little bit, but we're still at pretty high priced barley from a feeding perspective. And you need to think, or I guess from my perspective, we were hitting barley at $400 a metric ton, and corn was coming in from the US at $400 a metric ton. Barley coming in at 60% starch and corn coming in at 67 or 68% starch. It really wasn't a very fair price comparison between barley and corn. Yeah, I had to bring in some protein, but there was a lot more starch per unit of dollar coming in with corn than was with barley. And so that's a challenge with these high barley prices, is we are going to have competition from U.S. corn if they have the supply to come in. So I threw some numbers up here in terms of fecal starch, and you can see we moved from, in this case, 3 to 12%. 3 would be kind of our target, and we've been as low as 1% in many of our studies. I determined the fecal starch excretion, and this wouldn't be relevant for a cow, but this is very relevant for a finishing steer. Okay, they excrete about 2.2, 2.3 kilos of fecal dry matter every day. So if we multiply that fecal dry matter amount by the percent starch, you can see how much starch they're excreting on a daily basis. So that doesn't change based on barley price. But as soon as we start moving up that barley price, you can see at $400 a ton, if we're excreting, or cattle are excreting feces with 12% starch, those cows are excreting 11 cents a day in starch that didn't go into them. Okay, you add that to a 200-day feeding period, and you can completely erode any potential profits that are associated with that feeding phase. Okay, so barley grain processing is really key. And from a barley grower perspective, I think understanding barley grain processing is key to maintain a competitive and a demand for barley grain in our feeding sector. We're too early to share a lot of data, but there's a number of things we can do with barley grain processing that we can't do with corn, and we can do to actually increase the consistency of that processed barley sample. First one probably will be a bit challenged, at least in Saskatchewan, and that would be tempering. And there's an awful lot of tempering of barley grain that happens in Alberta. And with tempering, that barley is basically we add moisture so that we have about 80% dry matter. Okay, so we're adding about 8 to 10 percentage units of water. We allow it to soak for about 24 hours, and then we process it. And that tempering process does some really nice things for barley. The kernels swell, so that means we can process thinner kernels with more precision at the same roller setting as those heavier kernels. The water reduces the shattering as well. The main problem is in cold weather temperatures, we need to preheat that barley. We need to have warm water. We might be adding surfactants to increase that water absorption. And then there's a lot of bin maintenance in those tempering bins. And so many feedlots that are tempering don't temper consistently throughout the year, really leaving tempering a potential challenge. When you compare tempering and dry rolling, often we don't see any differences in feed efficiency. So it becomes a process that feeders might use more from the look of the barley or the look of the processed barley, but it's not translating into economic indicators that are going to drive that profitability in the feeding sector. We did some work with SAS Barley Funding looking at steam flaking, and steam flaking really gave us a huge opportunity. We got about a 7 to 9% improvement in feed efficiency. Problem now, we see energy costs going up, so flaking probably is not going to increase. We can't flake barley like we flake corn. Barley does not need to sit in the flaker nearly as long. But again, these economic drivers are probably going to challenge the flaking industry. So we're really looking at opportunity to use moisture-based technologies to try to ensure that every kernel that passes through the rollers are processed. And so one of the practices we're looking at right now is reconstituted high moisture barley. So this would be more analogous to high moisture corn, where we're taking barley, we can manage highly variable kernels. We add a lot of water, dropping the dry matter down to 65%. We process it and ferment it. And there's some really high capacity rollers that allow us to process a lot of barley at a single time. We can do this when environmental temperatures are suitable. We can cover that barley or pack the barley, cover that barley and let it sit, and it will preserve itself just like we would with silage. And we're really trying to understand how that barley that has been processed and stored in that way feeds out, both from a dairy cattle perspective, but also a feedlot cattle perspective. We're very optimistic. I think there'll be some great opportunity to make sure that we are not kicking out that high value barley in the feces. I think I went through both questions or all three questions with that long-winded answer. Do I process barley different, whether it's light or heavy kernel? No. I still want to see every kernel processed. What are we seeing with this year? We're seeing high protein, high fiber, low starch barley. That means there's energy reductions. Fortunate for growers, we're in a grain demand, and so you don't see feedlot operators discounting barley that much based on light test weight. Again, because of the light test weight, or probably more appropriate variable test weight, the barley grain that we're processing in bins because of receiving multiple loads has variable kernel size, and that does create a challenge for processing adequacy. Thanks for coming to listen. Hope you have some questions, and I'm enjoying the beer and the time to visit with you guys.
Is there many producers, maybe outside of feedlots, that are feeding barley unprocessed? And is there any difference to any of those questions if you're not processed?
Yeah, so the question was, are there producers feeding barley that is unprocessed? And This can be a very long answer. First of all, it depends what industry you're in. So if you're a sheep producer, there is no requirement to process barley. Sheep will process barley adequately by chewing. Okay? And the work is very clear. In fact, we ran a small study with our animal science students this past year where we compared adequately processed down to a 65% processing index to whole barley. There was absolutely no difference in growth performance for those lambs, absolutely no difference in feed intake, and carcass characteristics of the lambs didn't differ. So if we're talking sheep, don't process. It's not worth the energy investment. There's no requirement. If we're talking cows, calves, or finishing cattle, we absolutely need to process. And there's a number of different ways we could be processing. We could be using a hammer mill. A hammer mill, I think, is fine in a dairy scenario or a cow-calf scenario where you're feeding mostly forage. And then in that case, you can probably pulverize the barley quite a bit more than we would see in a feeding scenario where you're feeding high inclusion rates of barley. Work at the University of Alberta quite a while back in the 80s, showed that if you don't process barley and you're feeding cattle, particularly feeder cattle or backgrounding cattle, about 30% of the barley you feed is kicked out the back end of the cattle. So at this point in time, it's simply just not economical to forego processing. If we have really low cost barley and high energy costs, which I can't see happening at the same time, it might make sense not to process, but there is just too much loss. And it's really different than corn. Corn has this protein matrix that is indigestible. So even if you dry roll corn, the starch is not very digestible. With barley, it's that outer pericarp. It's that covering that hides the starch. For cattle, we really need to damage that pericarp to give the bugs inside the rumen access to that starch. And if we do that, the bugs can do a good job at digesting the starch and the protein that's available. So we're dealing with a completely different type of cereal grain. We really need to expose that starch, and if we do, we get good utilization. If we don't, like would happen with whole barley, a lot of it will be excreted in the feces.
Does that run true for hulls as well?
Yeah, the pericarp is still there in hull-less barley, so it's not changing a processing requirement. The hull itself is not the barrier. The big difference is with hull-less barley, you decrease the fiber content, so you increase the energy content. So there are some trade-offs, right? And Aaron talked about it. It's really the yield response that's probably the problem for hull-less barley, not a feeding quality perspective.
Question online, is there any work done on steam roll barley?
Yeah, steam rolled or steam flaking is really analogous terms. So I'm going to use a reference for corn. With corn, we would put the corn in a steam chest. We would expose it to high pressure, high temperature for 15 to 20 minutes. The work we did showed there was no advantage for barley of steaming that barley before rolling for more than 5 minutes. So because of that difference in kernel structure, we don't really have to steam that barley very long. We basically just allow it to accumulate some moisture so that when we put it through the rollers, it's not fracturing, it's compressing and spreading. And as I mentioned, I highlighted some of the steam flaking work. It's analogous to steam rolling. We have very large improvements in feed conversion efficiency. The challenge is we don't have a lot of flaking infrastructure in Western Canada. I know of 2 large feedlots in Alberta that can and do flake barley, wheat, and corn. So they have flaking capability. I know of producers that have talked about it in Saskatchewan, but I haven't seen any flaking equipment installed other than that is within feed mills. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Greg. And just before we end our live stream, Just wanted to point out that there's a few opportunities to get involved on the research side of things. One of our directors, Keith Rive, ran a field scale trial for our Barley Max project, which is looking at a bunch of different agronomic components of growing barley. And so we've got small plot trials across the province, including here at Yorkton at the East Central Research Farm. But there's room for farmers to be involved if they're interested. So by all means, reach out to me. We're working towards getting a project to get a better understanding of how the high residual N levels in the soil might impact barley production here this coming year. I think it's a pretty unique opportunity to have some pretty high residual nitrate levels following last year's drought. And so we're trying to figure out if there's a way we can detect that impact, and if there's adjustment to how you would make recommendations for malt barley production. So reach out to me, and my contact information is there or on the website, sassbarley.com. I encourage you to check it out.